Welcome to the Community Cats Podcast. I am your host, Stacy LeBaron. I've been involved helping homeless cats for over 20 years with the Merrimack River Feline Rescue Society. The goal of this podcast is to expose you to amazing people who are improving the lives of cats. And I hope these interviews will help you learn how you can turn your passion for cats into action. And today we're with Sara Kent. She's the CEO of Shelter Animals Count. And I have asked Sara to join us here for a special episode today to talk about the cat data trends. We really haven't had Sara on since COVID hit. And I think a lot has changed with regards to cats and cat intake and the trends across the country. And so Sara, I want to welcome you to the show, and you have a slide presentation for us today. So I'm going to turn things right over to you, and you can share your information and statistics, and then we'll have some questions at the end.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. So today I'm going to be presenting about cat data trends over the past few years that we've been able to see in Shelter Animals Count data. If you're not familiar with Shelter Animals Count, we are an independent nonprofit organization that is home to the national database. So this is used industry-wide, and we've created data standards that can be used throughout every community and every organization type. We've currently got thousands of shelters and rescues that are participating in Shelter Animals Count, and they're sharing their animal intake and outcome data with us monthly. All the data that's collected by Shelter Animals Count is published on our website. It's publicly available, presented without bias, and you can use the tools on the website to narrow things down from to your region, to your state, and even to your local organizations. And I am half of the team of Shelter Animals Count, and the other half of the team is Marie Amudanza, and she is our Director of Data and Technology. And none of this would be possible without her. She's the one who makes sure all the data is coming in smoothly and puts together all those beautiful dashboards on the Shelter Animals Count website. So today we're going to take a look at the recent history of shelter and rescue intake and outcome trends nationwide, and then take a closer look about what's happening with cats. So there's a lot of graphs in here. So I always say, if you're not a data person, the main thing you want to keep an eye out for are the patterns and the overall trajectory of the data that you're able to see when we're looking at multiple years of data together. The data source for this presentation is all coming out of the national database, and it's all been voluntarily submitted by Shelters and Rescues. This is a subset of the whole Shelter Animals Count data set. What we wanted to look at here was just the organizations that had consecutive monthly data from 2017 through October 2020. We've got data from 1,045 organizations across the country. So let's start out by looking at national intake across the entire country. So intake traditionally has a seasonality to it that's easily seen here by all of these mid-year peaks, and we're going to take a closer look at who's responsible for those peaks in the next slide. You can also see the obvious impact of COVID-19 as you look at 2020, which led to a dramatic drop in intake across the whole country. Even before that, intake was trending slightly downward between each year. 2019 was close in intake to 2018, but they were both down from 2017. So if we even remove 2020, things were sloping downward, but then when you add 2020 into it, things are moving much more sharply downward from an intake perspective. So let's take a look at what that looks like for cats versus dogs. So you can see here that when you break apart the cat and dog data, you can clearly see that it's the incoming cats that represent all those peaks and valleys from the last slide. There's really high seasonal variability in cat intakes, and anyone who works in a shelter or rescue is really familiar with that already. In 2019, the last full year of data that we have, dog intake showed a difference of 20% between the highest and the lowest intake months. Compared to cats, which showed a difference of 133% between the highest and lowest intake months. So very, very visible changes in the seasons for cats versus dogs. When we remove seasonality and just kind of look at how things are across the entire year, intake's pretty split evenly between cats and dogs up until we get to 2020 when everything changes. So now taking a look at cat intake by age, this is clearly the kitten season slide. So when we dig a little deeper and break apart total cat intake by age groups, we can clearly see that not only is it cats who comprise those drastic seasonal changes, but it's kittens specifically. Adult cat intake is actually pretty consistent until we get to that big drop in 2020. And then unknown is pretty consistent, as you can see, year over year. So now we're going to take a look at stray cat intake by age. And when it comes to stray intake, you can see that kitten seasonality again, while adult cats are fairly consistent and trending downwards. So you can see we actually went up a little bit in kitten intake in 2019, while unknown age cats and adult cats were both going downwards. As we get into owner relinquishments by age, that looks a little bit different in that adult cats are primarily entering shelters by these means. Kittens are being relinquished too, and the same seasonal patterns are here that you can see in stray intake. So I thought that was pretty interesting to point out. And of course, you can see that really big drop in 2020 with adult cat intake. Kittens are still coming in. So I thought that was really interesting to point out as well, is that kittens are coming in almost at the same pace as they were before. So now taking a look at transfers, currently I'll point out that all transfers are tracked together. So these cats being transferred could be from one neighboring shelter to another neighboring shelter, or transferred several states away. I'll talk a little bit more about how we're going to address that in data moving forward, starting in 2021. So you can see here that kittens are being transferred at a higher volume than adult cats, but both kitten and adult cats are increasing year over year. And you can see a lot of kitten movement happening in 2020. So now we're going to look at essentially the same data, but it's going to be presented in a different way to look deeper at each intake type by age. So cats primarily enter shelters as strays with quite a bit of seasonality, followed by owner relinquishment and transfers in. So now we're going to break each of those down by age group. So when we take a look at adult cat intake across the country, we can start to see some really interesting trends here. For adults, strays are the #1 reason they are entering shelters, followed by owner relinquishments, and finally transfers. And you can see there's really sizable dips in both stray and relinquished by owner intake of cats, and a less dramatic drop in the transfers in. So now when we look at kittens, the means in which kittens are entering shelters are the same as cats. So you can see the order there is the same, but there's a lot more seasonal variation, especially when it comes to these stray cats. Being able to measure that seasonality and how it trends year over year is a really important way for shelters to be able to build as much capacity as they can ahead of time through volunteers and foster homes, just to help manage these summer upswings in kitten intake. You can see they're just really consistent year over year. And even though it's slightly lower here, there's still a lot of kittens that are coming into organizations. So that's all, the patterns all still hold true for cats of unknown ages. So that means stray intake is the #1 means in which cats of all ages are entering shelters, followed by cats relinquished by their owners, and then transfers in. So now we're going to take a look at outcomes, and we're going to start with the return to owner rates. So I wanted to share the comparison of cat and dog return to owner rates because they're pretty different. So this is calculated by dividing the number of pets returned to their owner by the total number of stray intakes. So looking at 2019 and the last full year of data we had, the return to owner rates for dogs was 40%, and for cats it was 6%. So while you can see here that the return to owner rate for dogs has been slowly increasing year over year, it stayed pretty much the same for cats, and we really haven't seen a whole lot of change there. So I thought it might be interesting, given that, and given that stray cats are coming into shelters as the most frequent intake type, I thought it might be interesting to compare cats that are returned to owner to cats returned to field, and it was. So cats returned to field actually outpace cats returned to owner. And that makes sense. So if the majority of stray cats are coming into, or a majority of cats are coming in as strays to shelters, they may very well have been community cats and are being returned back to where they are found. So I'll also point out that this is specifically return to field cats, so cats who actually entered the shelter and then their outcome was going back out into the field. We are not currently tracking trap, neuter, return cats, which often don't enter shelters and just go through services to be spayed or neutered and be brought back to their caretaker. So I'll talk a little bit more about our plans to track those types of cats later on. So I also want to take a look at transfers out by age, because there is quite a bit of movement happening with cats. So you can see here that kittens are being transferred out to other organizations more frequently than adult cats, and they were increasing in volume until 2020. But even at 2020, it's still at a pretty high pace. I want to also take a look at cat euthanasia by age, and you can see here that that is also pretty rapidly decreasing year over year, with the lowest numbers in 2020. So now we're going to take a look at adoptions by age. So kitten and cat adoptions are actually pretty even with one another. Kittens are just slightly outpacing adult cats, and the adoption rate is seasonal as well. We're going to take a look at that a little bit closer too. So here's the difference in adoption rates for cats and dogs. So when we look at the adoption rate, we calculate that based on the percentage of adoptions out of stray, owner relinquishments, and other intake types, and then we subtract out those cats that have been returned to their owners. So we don't include transfers in this calculation so that we're not double counting any animals, and this allows you to see both adoptions as compared to the intake directly from the community, as well as get a sense of the demand, so to speak, that often drives transfers. So higher adoption rates correlate with lower intake rates consistently as we look at that year over year. So the peaks that we saw in the previous slides of cat intake are the valleys that you can see on the adoption rate slide. When cat intake decreases in the winter, the adoption rate goes up. So simply, the fewer animals entering shelters, the more likely they are to be adopted. And so these spikes that you see here in cat adoptions are happening in December. The average adoption rates across this timeline over these past few years are 89% for dogs and 77% for cats. You can see the COVID dog adoption spike that happened in the first quarter of 2020 on the orange line. It's really noticeable compared to all of those previous months. Since December has consistently been the highest adoption rate month for cats, and we're seeing lower intake numbers, plus an uptick of kitten transfers over the past couple of months. We're really curious to see if this is going to lead to the highest adoption rate for cats in 2020, and I hope so. So we'll have to wait and see what that data looks like when it comes in. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our future plans for data. So shelter animals count has been really focused around intake and outcome data, just measuring the number of animals, specifically the cats and dogs, entering shelters and rescue organizations. And we track that data month by month, but we know that is just a small portion of the work that shelters are doing, and that there's a lot more detail that would be helpful as shelters are getting more and more used to using data as a way to plan operations for their organization. So in 2021, we're going to make some additions to the current basic data matrix. We're going to add a breakdown of transfers. So right now it's just transfers in and transfers out. Next year, we'll start collecting that by transfers within the state, transfers outside of the state, and then transfers internationally. So we'll be able to track that both from an intake and outcome perspective and get a sense of how the animals are moving across state lines or perhaps even internationally. We're also going to break out a category for cruelty cases and in impounds so that we're able to more accurately track that information. We're also going to be adding additional species. So we've heard from shelters, that are taking in rabbits and horses and all of these other animals that aren't currently tracked anywhere at a national level. And so we'll be able to start tracking all these types of animals that are coming into shelters and rescues. And then we're going to be adding some new data collection that's not been done before. So next year we will be launching a community services matrix, and that's going to allow us to track all of these other things that shelters are doing out in their communities and that other nonprofits are doing to support animals and their people. So we'll be able to track things like veterinary services, we'll be able to track trap, neuter, return, we'll be able to track all these various types of community support that are helping to keep pets with their people. So we're really excited about that and helping to present a much more holistic view of what is happening both within organizations as well as within communities. And then finally, another data effort that we have going on is a study into animal level data. So right now, all the data that Shelter Animals Count collects is considered summary data. It's the total number of animals in each of these categories. But we're working on a study with the Center for Shelter Dogs at Tufts University to be able to dive into animal level data and track things like being able to more specifically track ages and length of stay and basically the entire journey from the time the pet gets into the shelter to the time the pet leaves. We think we'll be able to get some really interesting insights from that we can that will have a lot of national value. And so then once we have all of this additional data, we'll be able to do much more holistic data reporting. So you'll be able to look at a community and be able to see what's happening with the intake and outcome numbers for the organizations in that community. What are all of these supplemental services that are happening outside of shelter walls? And then what's also happening with the people in that community. So we currently use US Census data within our dashboards to be able to put some human demographics behind the animal data that we're collecting. So you can see population levels and even poverty levels in various communities and how that might impact the animals that are in need in that community. So we're really excited about that. And if you're interested in more data, the whole Shelter Animals Count data set is available on our website by clicking the Explore the Data button. And then under the data menu, you can also find our COVID impact dashboard and reports, as well as annual data reports. So we've got white papers for each year of data that we've collected over the past 4 years. So if you're interested in data, there's a lot of that available on the website.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah, it was fun to pull out all this cat data. It's been a while since we've done that. We've kind of done it like month over month with the COVID data, but being able to like look at these several years in a row was actually really cool.
Yeah. So I have my questions here for you.
Sure.
One, I know you mentioned it at the beginning, but I just would like to repeat it. If there are organizations that aren't part of Shelter Animals Count, they can join at any time, right?
Absolutely. Shelters can join Shelter Animals Count at any time, especially currently, if they're taking in any animals, adopting out animals, they should be joining Shelter Animals Count. All of that data is really important to be able to fully map out everything across the country. So big or small, we really encourage organizations to join.
So if you're a rescue and you don't have a physical shelter, you run out of foster homes, you still can participate in this?
Absolutely.
And if you do put your adoption information and certain software, are there certain software packages that work well with Shelter Animals Count that they dovetail to better with one another? Are there any recommendations there?
They've all the shelter software people are really into data, and so they've been incredibly supportive of the work Shelter Animals Count does. So in just about all the shelter software, and certainly all the major shelter software providers, you can find a dedicated Shelter Animals Count report. in the reporting section, download that, and it's already formatted for the shelter animals count basic data matrix, and they just need to log in and upload that. So if they're new to shelter animals count, they can also use that to backfill some of that historic data, which is really helpful for projects like this where we're able to look at things year over year.
So Sarah, I was wondering if you could help me. This one question that I get. I've worked with, so many groups here in the Northeast with TNR programs as well as spay-neuter programs for owned cats. And I talk with folks that are down in the South, especially sort of in the southeastern part of the country. And, there are many people who go, Stacy, you know what, you have winters in the Northeast, and, we never are. We're always in kitten season in the Southeast. And so therefore, that's why this is so much harder for us to really get the population reduced for cats. But then I've heard from some other people saying that there really still are kitten seasons in the Southeast and other southern parts of the United States. So what are you seeing based on the data?
Yeah, we do see kitten season fairly consistently. I mean, sometimes the spikes are a little less dramatic depending on the region, but here we took a look at the South Atlantic states, and you can see there's certainly a kitten season. So this is just straight intake of cats under 5 months, but there is quite a bit of variation that you can see in the seasons. It's going down, which is good to see. But we are still certainly seeing a lot of seasonality between the winter months and the summer months here in the South.
So there is a cycle still going on there. So because you're going from 2,000 to 10,000, so that's a pretty significant growth rate in the summertime. I mean, ideally, it would be great if the South could have their kitten season in December through February. That would be really wonderful, because in New England, if we have a kitten season, we have it in the summertime. So if it could be balanced out that way, but we don't live in that kind of a world, unfortunately.
That would make life a lot easier for everybody, yes. If only the cats would adhere.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about COVID and the adoption rates. I think there was an adoption rate slide, and it seemed like with the dogs, you saw a big spike of COVID adoptions, but you didn't see that with the cats at the same time. So how do you interpret that?
Yeah, I think a lot of that was really less on the adoption side and more on the intake side. So I think that the reason there was such a really high adoption rate for dogs is that there were just so many fewer dogs coming into shelters during that period of time. And so not everybody, but of course, there's so many dogs who were coming in were getting adopted. And, we saw the rate in a little bit here, as you can see, it went over 100%. And so, a lot of dogs that had been there, what that usually means is dogs that were already there, were getting adopted. And so just anecdotally, we've heard from a lot of shelters that have seen some longer time residents get adopted during this kind of adoption frenzy, which is a really great thing. But I think the math there is really more on the intake side of it, where we saw just so many fewer dogs coming in that period of time. And we saw fewer cats too, but it wasn't just nearly as dramatic of a drop.
So you just said that the intake of cats wasn't as dramatic as the drop of the intake of dogs in there. So shelters throughout the whole COVID period sort of still continued to, you're seeing here intake by species here. The cats, it was like it went down earlier. The intakes went down earlier, but then rebounded really fast. What's that? Is that low point there? Is that March? Where right there?
I think it was April.
That's April.
And which is really, March was kind of the start of everything. And so when we did a regional breakdown earlier this year, we saw, particularly on the West Coast, on the East Coast, like those areas where COVID really spiked early, we saw a much earlier drop in intake versus when it started to kind of happen across the country, more shutdown orders were in place, and kind of everything started to change nationally. Then that's where the data was really much more dramatic in April.
Yeah, that's really, it's interesting how the cats responded differently, in a different way. And it looks like the dogs, if it trends out, if that line sort of levels out, it'll be a much lower drop on the intake side with regards to dogs, where the cats will have a drop, but it doesn't look that significantly different. So I'm just thinking about all the rethinking sheltering and all that kind of stuff, and it maybe is making a greater impact on the dog population, but yet still the intakes are happening with cats. In thinking about how our operations work, and I work with a lot of cat-only organizations, and so we're like, oh, maybe we're gonna, have shelters without any cages, or that kind of thing. But I'm looking at this intake data, and I understand maybe they're going to foster care, maybe they're not, going into cages in the building and that kind of thing. But in terms of the numbers that are being classified, as an intake, it's still, we have to have comparable programs, I guess, working. We're still going to take in 200 cats a year or something like that, where, if we're doing it through foster care or through a facility, but yet those numbers may be going down, but not, certainly doesn't look like as dramatically as the dogs.
Yeah. And, cats typically tend to kind of lag behind dogs when it comes to data. We saw the dog population starting to go down earlier than we saw cat populations. And so it may just take a little bit of time for that to catch up across the country when it comes to cats. But yeah, we're seeing both rebound, but dogs are rebounding at just such a much lower level than we've seen in the past few years, whereas cats it's still a much lower level, but it is just a more dramatic uptick than we're seeing for the dog rebound.
And then it seems like you're seeing transfers increase in general across the board. And especially with kittens, and then it looks like adult cats, the transfers are spiking up on those non-kitten season periods. And the way I'm looking at the chart is it is sort of trending up, so cats and kittens are starting to move, or either internally or around the country at a greater rate.
They are, yeah, which, I think, New England's been transferring cats in for years, but I think that's still kind of an anomaly for a lot of the rest of the country, there's just been no room for cats, no room to bring in more cats. But being able to see kind of what's been happening year over year, and I think as the dog population in shelters is going down, the population in the shelter changes a bit. And then in 2020, we start to see the highest number of kittens being transferred in than we've seen before, which I think is really interesting. And it means that shelters have the space to be able to bring those kittens in, which is also just really encouraging. And so, there's so much conversation this summer about where are these animals? The intake has dropped so much. Where are they? Why aren't they coming into shelters? And I don't think anyone still has a really clear answer for that. Like, is it just that people are moving less frequently, or they're home more, or, what is happening that is preventing these animals from coming into shelters? And then how do we keep that support up for people as they start to go back to work and life, returns to some semblance of normalcy? So we're seeing a lot of shelters, there's shelters that are transferring in more animals. There's also shelters that are just changing their focus entirely and focusing much more on helping keep pets out of shelters rather than, focusing on bringing more animals in. And so creating services, doing more trap, neuter, return efforts, doing more pet owner support, being able to provide more low-cost veterinary services, and doing what they can to preserve that relationship between the people and their pets versus, having shelter intake be the only option. So there's lots of programs out there. The Human Animal Support Services program that started a few months ago and has been really widely adopted by a lot of shelters across the country is focused on just that. How do you provide this support that allows these families to stay together? It doesn't require you to have a ton of money in order to have a pet. It's really just about the love for that pet and the care for that pet. So it's been, it's been a shift that's been coming fairly slowly the past few years, kind of in conjunction with this downturn of intake. But it really sped up over these past few months, and everyone's really realized the need for it. And it's great timing, right? So, as shelters, we're kind of rethinking everything. We've got a lot of, the country in economic crisis, where you've got people who need help to be able to keep their pets. So they're doing these drive-by pet food pantries where they're just like, putting things in people's trunks and just trying to find all these really creative ways to support their communities. And then still doing adoptions at the same time. So, doing these virtual meet and greets and all these other really creative ways to kind of keep things moving for the pets in their community. So it's just been really impressive. Shelters are always impressive, but to see the way that they've responded to this crisis is amazing. And a lot of rescue organizations are doing the same. Rescues, they were doing a ton of adoptions earlier this year. This was really new to shelters. And so a lot of them had to kind of start from zero as far as, getting all of these foster homes, doing adoptions straight from the foster home, doing all these virtual, introductions of animals, whereas doing that for a while. And so they've just kind of amped up the work they were already doing. When we're able to really, take advantage of this adoption craze at the beginning of the year and move a lot of animals. So, even the smaller organizations are really responding to this positively in the face of a lot of terrible things happening in the world. Animals have certainly been a bright spot.
That's great. Sara, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being a guest and doing this special episode for the Community Cats podcast and sharing all of this cat data. It's been great. It's really, I love it. So it's wonderful, but I also think it's great for all of us to keep an eye on what's going on around the country for cats and just thinking about how we're running our programs and what we're doing for cats in our community. So I want to thank you again for being a guest on the show. And hopefully we'll have Shelter Animals Count on the show again in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.